Hey guys, we are here to talk about speciation and how that occurs through natural selection. So speciation is basically the creation of a new species from a pre-existing one. This takes a very, very long time to happen, millions and millions of years. Very rarely you can get it in thousands of years. Sometimes for organisms like bacteria that can reproduce so quickly, they can occur in a much shorter time span. But for most of your organisms, especially the ones we think about, your birds, mammals, those kinds of things, millions of years. In order for a new species to be created, there needs to be what we call reproductive isolation. So this new species has to not interbreed with the old species. It will occur in a population as a whole, so not just one organism, it's got to be the whole population. And the end result is a distinct species. There are different modes of speciation which occur. So the first one we're going to talk about is allopatric speciation. So that's our big term right here, allopatric speciation. This is based on geography. So what happens is that a physical barrier has to come up between the populations. This could be continents separating, like in the case of Pangea. It could be a river forming, a rift valley forming, something like that. But what that physical barrier does is prevent breeding between the two species. So a very simplistic view up here would be that there is a lizard, and then a valley occurs in their habitat, so that part of the lizard population is living on one side, the other part's on the other side. Over millions of years, these guys will only breed with the ones on the left side of the valley. These guys will breed with the right side, and then in the end, even if that valley goes away, they are a completely separate and distinct species. A real-world example would be the western elephant versus the savanna elephant. So there's actually two species of elephants living in Africa. For a while, they thought it was one species, and until, I want to say it was like 2005, maybe 2015, I'm not really sure. But in the 2000s, they ran some genetic tests and found that these are actually distinct species of elephants. You've got a savanna elephant and a western elephant. And this western or forest elephant lives in a completely different environment than the savanna elephant, and they are distinct species. They do not interbreed. Another mode of speciation is by creating an ecological niche. So a niche is a role that the species will have in the environment, and it's a very specific role. So pollinator, decomposer, those are different niches. The divergence between the population will occur because they use different roles in the environment. And this usually happens when there's multiple lineages in a specific area and time. So the example is this butterfly up here. Some fighting. Give me a moment. All right, we're back. So we've got this butterfly species up here. You can see that there's a bunch of different variations. This is one species, and this is the other species. This species is the poisonous species, and this other species is mimicking that poisonous species in the hopes that it will not be eaten. So they're both pollinators in the environment, but one of them developed a poison, and the other one developed those same colors so that it would not get eaten by its predators. This also happens very commonly in birds based on what they eat. So down here we've just got generic birds. But if you're looking at their beaks, you can see that there's very, very different beaks. This would be like a hummingbird. It's got a very long, slender beak so it can get pollen. This bird eats seeds, so it's very sharp. It can break open that seeds. Fruit needs a sharper beak, but not as sharp as seeds, because fruit is usually a lot easier to break into. So just based on different food sources, they'll develop into different species. All right, modes of speciation. Again, we've got mating, behavior, and timing.
I picked up a frog.
Yeah, that's your frog. Okay, so sexually reproductive species usually or often have mating rituals, and if these rituals become different, then they can be selective in the type or in the species that's being generated.
I picked up a frog in the marsh and I hold it in my hand in the cup.
Do you remember what it was called?
A leopard frog.
Right, so our real world example is a leopard frog being held by Evie here, and a pickerel frog. They started mating at different times, so I believe the leopard frog started mating earlier than the pickerel frog was, and as time went on, because it kept mating earlier and earlier and earlier, it became a distinct species. So now we have two species instead of one, the leopard frog and the pickerel frog. But you can get timing differences, but you can also get the mating behavior. So maybe if a mating dance is different and some females are attracted to both of those dances, it would be eventually a new species being created. Another mode of speciation is what we call polyploidy.
Flower.
It's when you get a duplicated set of chromosomes, and that just happens randomly by accident. Okay. They are automatically reproductively isolated because of that duplicated set of chromosomes. They can't really pair with anything else. So flowers have a special thing where they can actually self-pollinate or self-fertilize, and that can generate a new species. This occurs pretty rapidly, so not necessarily in the millions of years, but more in the thousands. And it happens most often in plants because plants are capable of self-replicating or self-pollinating much easier than a more complex or animal species is. So this is the Gia plant up here, and that's just one example where it became polyploidy, so it had an extra set of chromosomes, self-fertilized, and became a new species. Hybridization is another type of speciation. It's when you have two very closely related species that can come back into contact with each other and cross and mate. The common example that I know many of you thinking of would be like a liger, lion, tiger. They can mate, they can produce an offspring. However, that liger cannot then produce more offsprings. It's sterile. So this is very rare because most of the times when you have crossing like that, it produces a sterile offspring, so one that can't produce its own babies, which means it's not actually a new species. But every once in a while, you do get some that can cross and then produce offspring. And that would then eventually create a new species. This occurs most often in insects and fish, but we do have an example with the great skua. So you had two different species of skua that then crossbred, producing a new species, the great skua. Now, there is something that I want to talk about, which we've heard before. There's acclimation or acclimatization and adaptation. Adaptation actually occurs when DNA changes, which then leads to a phenotypic change. So remember, DNA is the genotype, phenotype is what you look like. So as our genotype changes, our phenotype will change too. And that is an adaptation. It's brought about usually by changes in habitat. So if it gets colder, you might have more fur. In a warmer environment, you might have less fur. If it's colder environment, animals tend to be smaller to conserve body heat. If it's in a warmer environment, they can be bigger. But this takes a long time, and it occurs again at a whole population level, so not just an individual. And it's based off the fact that you have variation in the species, right? So Eli's got red hair, Evie's got blonde hair. That's variation in our species. Over time, if there is an advantage to having red hair or blonde hair, like Evie might blend in a colder environment, Eli would probably do better in a warmer environment, although he'll sunburn more easily. Yeah.
I have a Pokeball.
Thank you.
There
will be an advantage.
Something.
No, thank you. There will be an advantage. So that advantage would mean that you could have more offspring, which means that it would pass it on through your genetics. So adaptation is specifically related to genetics and being able to inherit that characteristic. So you have to have red hair from a parent to be able to inherit red hair as a child. Okay? But acclimatization is when there's a change that is not related to your genetics, and it'll happen because of an environmental change, but it doesn't impact the whole group. That's just on an individual level, and it's usually temporary.
Mommy.
So here's some examples. One of the biggest examples is going at high altitude. Okay, so your body can acclimatize to high altitude by producing more red blood cells. You as an individual will produce more red blood cells. But if you go down back to sea level, your body will adapt. It'll get rid of all those extra red blood cells. If you have a child at high elevation, it doesn't automatically have more red blood cells. It also has to acclimatize. So this is not a genetic change. It's just your body reacting to a very specific environment, or shivering, things like that. Adaptation, like I said, has to be a genetic change. So this is your chameleon up here. Its ability to change its color and blend in with the environment is inherited. That produced an advantage so that they wouldn't be found and eaten as often, which means they would have more babies, which means that their babies would then be able to blend in, and those would survive longer, thus having more babies, and so on and so on. All right, so individuals with traits that are better suited to their environment are more likely to survive. We know that, right? If I can blend into a forest, I'm not going to get eaten by a lion or a tiger. These individuals are then able to reproduce more, which is ultimately the goal in life, and create changes that are then inherited by that population because of the characteristics that help them survive to begin with. So this occurs through an overproduction, so you can produce more offspring. Like, as you know, seahorses have like 500 babies at once. Not all of them survive, but because they have so many, a lot of them are likely to survive. It also depends on the variation. You have to have variation. You have to have variation in the population in order to be able to produce these changes. And then some of those variations have to be better to survive in, right? So like if I live in a forest and I am bright pink in color, that variation is not helpful to me. I'm going to get found and eaten, unless that bright pink means that I'm poisonous, and then people stay away. Okay. So we often call this, or have often heard of it, as called survival of the fittest. But fittest doesn't mean that like I work out so much and now I'm a great runner and I can run really fast. It means that I've survived long enough to produce the most offspring. So fittest in biology directly relates to the amount of offspring you are producing. So survival of the fittest means that you are able to produce the most offspring, thus surviving and passing your genes on to the next generation. This was all proposed by Darwin, as I'm sure you guys know, who traveled to the Galapagos Island and he studied finches. All of the finches were very similar, but they had small changes in the size and shape of their bill, and that was best suited to their food sources. So then what he did is he went back to South America and he found that there were similar finches, but because the islands were separated from South America, they became reproductively isolated in those islands, and therefore creating a new species. He termed it actually descent with modification, so not survival of the fittest. That came later. These are just some examples of his finches. You can see that they've got different types of bills based on what they're eating. So insect eaters kind of all have these same sharp, short bills so that they can get into that exoskeleton. Seed eaters, again, very sharp, that kind of stuff. So it was just, you can see that they're very similar with just minor changes.
Mommy.
Evolution is then the next logical step and where we're headed after this. So once we have all this variation and the environment is exerting a pressure on this species, saying that some of them are better able to survive, eventually over time what happens is what we call evolution, which is what we're going to be getting into. And we've got lots of other information that we're going to add to it. Please let me know if you guys have any more questions.